Tonight, we begin in the heart of Africa, under the vast sky of the Central African Republic. Imagine the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth, the buzzing of insects and the distant call of birds echoing across the forests. This was a place of untouched beauty, but it was also a land long under the control of foreign powers. The year is 1960 and the winds of change are beginning to stir across the African continent. The Central African Republic, one of the many territories once controlled by the French, is on the cusp of a new beginning. Before we begin, if this little corner of calm has brought you any comfort, feel free to like the video and subscribe only if it feels genuine to you. No pressure. I'd also love to hear from you. Just drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always special to know we're all quietly gathered here from different corners of the world, like a family, scattered but still connected. Alright, now go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan or a soft hum in the background, something that feels like home. Nestle in, get cozy, and let's ease into tonight's story together. The year is 1960, but before we dive into the momentous change of independence, we must first wind the clock back to a time before the flags of independence flew in this lush green land. The Central African Republic, then called Ubangishari, had been under French colonial rule for decades. The French, with their towering presence, shaped nearly every aspect of the land. French was the official language, and the systems of governance, education, and law were all designed to maintain French authority. But underneath this seemingly stable structure, a current of discontent was growing. The people of Ubangishari were becoming increasingly aware of the inequities that colonial rule imposed upon them. The land, rich in resources, was being exploited, and the people were relegated to the margins of their own society. It wasn't long before the idea of independence began to take hold in the hearts of the Central African people. French colonialism had made its mark, but so had the indigenous resistance movements bubbling quietly in the background. Historians still argue whether the first stirrings of resistance were fueled more by the economic inequalities or the cultural resentment felt by the people towards their colonizers. The road to independence wasn't swift. It was a slow and methodical march, often hidden from the spotlight, taking place in the corners of villages and in the hearts of political activists. This was the beginning of the end for colonialism in Central Africa. Yet it wasn't an easy fight. The struggle for freedom from French rule was as much about confronting the physical barriers of colonialism as it was about overcoming the mental barriers imposed on a people who had long been told they couldn't govern themselves. The struggle for independence in the Central African Republic was not just a single flash of defiance, but a series of quiet, steady ripples that reverberated through the hearts of those who had long endured colonial rule. You can almost picture it: small meetings in darkened rooms in quiet villages where dreams of a free nation were whispered far from the colonial authorities' ears. The colonial powers were still in control, but they were beginning to feel the weight of change pressing against them. The people were growing restless, their desire for self-determination taking root in the fertile soil of the land. France, in its efforts to solidify its empire, had incorporated vast stretches of Africa into its colonial holdings. One of these was Ubangishari, a land rich with natural resources but far from the French metropolitan heart. The French influence stretched far beyond the political, through language, through education, through law, and this created a complex web of power and dependency that was hard to unravel. But despite the French insistence on maintaining control, the winds of resistance began to gain strength. But what kind of resistance was this? Historians still argue whether the resistance movements in Central Africa were truly organic, or whether they were stirred by the global tides of decolonization that swept across the world. The truth is, the Central African resistance was a bit of both, partly inspired by the broader global movements for independence, and partly driven by the unique struggles faced by the people of Ubangishari. This early resistance, though largely non-violent, was growing in intensity. The French, ever wary of losing their colonial grip, began to turn their attention to these murmurings of dissent. In 1946, the French government made a key move, granting the territories of French Equatorial Africa a certain degree of self-governance within the French Union. Yet despite this shift, the people of Ubangishari were far from satisfied. This was a first step, but not nearly enough to quench the thirst for real independence. And so while the French attempted to placate the growing voices for freedom, the Central African people quietly prepared for the next stage in their long fight, a stage that would see the rise of figures who would go on to shape the future of the nation. As the French continued to provide some degree of self-governance, the people of Ubangishari grew increasingly restless. The veneer of autonomy could only mask the deeper yearning for true independence. In the shadows of the colonial administration, local resistance movements found their voices and they were ready to be heard. Resistance in Ubangishari wasn't just about political rhetoric or intellectual argument, it was deeply personal. The people had suffered under a foreign power for far too long, and it was this collective memory of hardship that fueled the fire of independence. In the 1940s and 1950s, the winds of decolonization were sweeping across Africa, and the colonial powers, including France, found themselves under increasing pressure to relinquish control. The struggle for independence was no longer just a local issue, it had become part of a larger continent-wide movement. And in this environment, local leaders began to rise to prominence, providing much-needed direction for the burgeoning independence movement. One such leader was Barthélemy Baganda, a man who would come to symbolize the hope and the struggle of the Central African Republic. A teacher by training, Baganda was deeply influenced by the suffering of his people. His journey into politics was not a conventional one. Historians still debate whether Baganda's rise to power was solely due to his undeniable charisma and leadership qualities, or if it was a matter of timing as the winds of change in Africa created fertile ground for his ideas to take root. Baganda's vision for Ubangishari was clear. He sought a unified independent state where the people would no longer be shackled by foreign rule. He founded the Progressive Party of Central Africa in 1949, rallying those who shared his dream of freedom. Through his leadership, the movement gained momentum and the idea of an independent Central African Republic became a tangible possibility. His call for unity and self-determination resonated deeply with the people, particularly in rural areas where the scars of colonialism ran deep. Baganda's message was simple: the people of Ubangishari deserved to rule themselves. However, despite his rising popularity, Baganda faced significant challenges. The French, ever wary of losing their grip on Africa, were reluctant to grant full independence. Instead, they offered a political compromise, a system that would allow for a measure of self-governance but still keep the colonial power firmly in control. But as much as the French hoped for this half-measure to appease the people, it was clear that Baganda's dream was much bigger, and so the stage was set for a larger, more direct confrontation with colonial rule. Barthélemy Baganda's political rise had ignited a fire in the hearts of many in Ubangishari, yet his vision for an independent nation was still a distant dream. As the leader of the Progressive Party of Central Africa, Baganda believed fervently in unity, the idea that all ethnic groups in the country should come together to form a singular, independent nation. His words resonated in villages and cities alike, and people began to believe in the possibility of a free, self-governing Central African Republic. However, the path to independence was far from certain, and his leadership faced many hurdles. In the late 1950s, the French government, keen on maintaining its hold over its colonies, introduced a new plan, one that would supposedly grant autonomy to its African territories, while still keeping a tight grip on power. This plan, known as the French Community, was intended to create a sort of halfway point between colonialism and full independence. French leaders believed that they could maintain control over their colonies while giving the impression of progress towards self-rule. But as you might guess, this offer was met with suspicion and resistance. Baganda, who had long advocated for full independence, was not satisfied with such a compromise. Historians still argue whether his refusal to accept partial autonomy was due to his unwavering principles or whether he had simply realized that this was merely a half-hearted attempt to delay real freedom. For Baganda, the vision was clear: Ubangishari had to be free from French control, not just in name, but in practice. His determination for full independence became even more resolute as he gained political strength, or But as much as Buganda pushed for independence, he was not alone. A growing number of people, including fellow political leaders and activists, began to rally behind his vision. The movement was no longer just about one man's dream, it had become a collective aspiration for the Central African people. The French, increasingly aware of the pressure building in their colonies, began to realize that full independence was now inevitable. The question then was not whether the Central African Republic would become independent, but when. As the momentum for independence grew, so too did the political instability. Buganda's leadership faced challenges from various political factions within the country. His ability to unify the different ethnic groups, while powerful, was not without its difficulties. Some historians point out that while he was seen as a beacon of hope by many, he also faced resistance from certain groups who were more wary of the changes he proposed. Was his vision too ambitious? Could his dream of unity truly overcome the deep ethnic divides that existed in the country? These were questions that would only be answered as the struggle for independence unfolded. And then in 1959, just a year before independence, tragedy struck. The year 1959 marked a critical turning point in the Central African Republic's journey toward independence. It was a time of rising hope, but also one of intense uncertainty. In a tragic twist, Barthélemy Buganda, the visionary leader, who had galvanized the movement for a united independent country, died in a plane crash. His death was a shocking blow to the independence movement. The nation, still grappling with its colonial past and eager for a better future, now faced a deep sense of loss, and the question lingered: what would happen to the dreams Buganda had inspired? Historians still debate the circumstances surrounding Buganda's death. Was it truly an accident, or did something more sinister lie behind it? Conspiracy theories have swirled ever since, suggesting that the plane crash was no mere accident, but rather a politically motivated act. While the official narrative is that it was a mechanical failure, the uncertainty surrounding his death only added fuel to the fire of distrust between the Central African Republic and the French authorities. For many, his death represented more than just the loss of a leader. It was a symbol of how the colonial power, even in its waning days, still managed to exert control over the fate of the country. In the wake of Buganda's death, the political landscape of Ubangishari began to shift. The responsibility for leading the independence movement now fell to others. David Dacko, Buganda's ally and a former president of the Territorial Assembly, emerged as the new leader. He was seen as a steady hand, someone who could maintain stability in a time of great uncertainty. While he lacked Buganda's charisma and the same radical vision for a unified nation, Dacko was a pragmatist, a leader who understood the delicate balance of achieving independence without losing the gains that had already been made. Dacko inherited a fragile situation. The French, although preparing to relinquish control, still had a powerful influence over the region. Even as the winds of independence blew stronger, they did so against the backdrop of French policies that continued to shape the direction of the country. Some historians still argue whether Dacko's leadership was truly independent or whether it was merely a continuation of French influence, as he had strong ties to France and was seen by some as a compromise candidate chosen by the French themselves. Was he a puppet leader or a legitimate symbol of the Central African people's will? This remains a subject of ongoing debate among scholars. Nevertheless, under Dacko's leadership, the country continued on its path toward independence. His government began negotiating with the French for a peaceful transition, although many in the country were uncertain about what this transition would truly mean for their future. Despite the challenges, the independence movement remained strong, and the idea of a free, self-determined Central African Republic was becoming more of a reality with each passing day. The final push for independence would come in 1960, but the legacy of Buganda's leadership, as well as the tumultuous path that had brought the country to this point, would never be forgotten. The death of Barthélemy Buganda in 1959 cast a long shadow over the Central African Republic's road to independence. But even in the wake of this tragedy, the momentum for independence was unstoppable. The country's leaders, including the new president David Dacko, pressed forward with renewed urgency. As France began to lose its grip on its African colonies, the French government could no longer hold back the tide of change. Independence was now an inevitability, though the precise terms were still being negotiated. In the years leading up to 1960, the French had undergone a profound shift in their approach to their African colonies. The independence movements had become too powerful to ignore, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain the colonial status quo. The French, who had once seen their empire as a source of immense power and prestige, now found themselves on the defensive. Throughout the 1950s, the wave of decolonization that swept across the continent reached its peak. Across Africa, colonies were demanding their freedom, and the French could no longer resist the tide. Despite the shifts in French policy, the transition to independence for the Central African Republic was anything but smooth. The Central African people were eager for freedom, but the reality of governing a newly independent nation presented significant challenges. As the French withdrew, they left behind a nation that was still deeply dependent on foreign aid, struggling with political instability, and divided by ethnic tensions. Historians still argue whether the French really wanted to grant full independence to their former colonies, or whether they saw it as the only option in the face of widespread unrest. The question remains, was the French withdrawal from Africa a genuine commitment to self-determination, or was it simply the result of external pressures from the global decolonization movement? At the same time, the Central African Republic's leaders were preparing for the final push toward full independence. With Dacko at the helm, negotiations with the French began to take shape. The country would be granted independence on August 13, 1960, along with 13 other African nations that had been under French rule. For the people of Ubangishari, the moment was bittersweet. It was a long-awaited victory, but it was also a new beginning fraught with uncertainty. The country would now have to chart its own course in a world where the echoes of colonialism still resonated deeply. Even as the country celebrated its newfound freedom, the challenges ahead were clear. Independence did not immediately translate into prosperity or stability. The new government under Dacko was still very much in its infancy. The political system was fragile, the economy was dependent on France, and the people, though jubilant, were unsure about what independence would truly bring. Would the nation be able to overcome the divisions between ethnic groups? Could Dacko lead the country toward true self-sufficiency, or would the legacy of colonialism continue to hold the nation back? These were the questions that lay ahead, and their answers would shape the course of the nation for years to come. On August 13, 1960, the Central African Republic officially gained its independence from France. The event was celebrated across the country, and for the first time in its modern history, the people of Ubangishari, now the Central African Republic, were able to raise their flag high with pride, no longer subject to colonial rule. The day was filled with joy, excitement, and a sense of liberation, but as the celebrations died down, the reality of the nation's newfound independence began to set in. It was clear that the path to self-determination would be far from easy. Historians still debate whether the independence granted in 1960 was truly the result of a peaceful transition, or if it was a tactical decision by the French to avoid further bloodshed and unrest. In many of their African colonies, particularly in Algeria, France had faced violent uprisings and bloody resistance. In contrast, the Central African Republic, along with other French African territories, experienced a relatively peaceful transition. But that didn't mean the road ahead was without obstacles. As much as the people of the Central African Republic had fought for their freedom, they were now faced with the hard task of building a nation from the ground up. Under President David Dacko, the Central African Republic began to navigate the complex world of post-independence governance. Dacko, though a product of the colonial system, was a symbol of hope for the people embodying the desire for self-rule and national unity. However, as much as he tried to steer the country towards stability, he faced an uphill battle. The political landscape was fragmented, with different ethnic groups vying for power and influence. Many of the country's traditional leaders were hesitant to relinquish control, and the new government was still struggling with issues of corruption and inefficiency. Despite these challenges, Dacko was determined to keep the country on its path toward prosperity. However, his leadership was soon overshadowed by the ongoing influence of France. The French had not fully relinquished their hold on their former colonies. Instead, they had fostered a system of France-Afrique which kept many African leaders dependent on France politically, economically, and militarily. Although the Central African Republic was now officially independent, the relationship between the country and France was far from severed. Historians still debate whether Dacko was truly in control of his country or whether France continued to exert a quiet influence using economic ties and political leverage to keep the Central African Republic within its sphere of influence. In addition to these external pressures, the country faced significant internal challenges. The economy was weak, reliant on a single export timber and foreign aid. There was little infrastructure, and the country's political system was still immature, prone to instability and conflict. The social divisions between the various ethnic groups made it difficult for the government to unite the population under a single national identity. As Dacko worked to establish the country as a democratic state, he struggled to balance the competing interests of the different regions and groups. It was clear that independence had not solved all the problems of the Central African Republic, but it had opened the door to a future where those problems could be addressed on the nation's terms. For the people of the Central African Republic, their newfound independence was a step into the unknown. There was hope for the future, but also a deep sense of uncertainty. Would the country be able to rise above the legacy of colonialism? Could it overcome the divisions that had been sown during the colonial era? These questions lingering in the air would only be answered as the years passed, with each challenge faced and each victory won. But for now, independence had been achieved, and the Central African Republic could finally begin to write its own story. As the Central African Republic navigated its early years of independence, the challenges of nation-building became painfully clear. The country, now freed from French colonial rule, was still a far cry from stability. David Dacko, the first president of the newly independent republic, found himself at the helm of a country that was fragile and uncertain. The joy of independence had quickly faded into the sobering reality that the challenges of governance were far greater than anyone had anticipated. Dacko's leadership, though well-intentioned, faced immediate difficulties. The government struggled with political instability and corruption, which eroded the public's trust. While Dacko had hoped to create a unified national identity, the divisions among ethnic groups remained a significant obstacle. These divisions, long exacerbated by the colonial administration, continued to shape the country's politics. Dacko was caught between the need to represent all groups and the reality that some factions sought to advance their own interests, sometimes at the expense of the nation's unity. This political instability was exacerbated by the economic challenges the country faced. Despite being rich in resources, the Central African Republic lacked the infrastructure and investment necessary to fully exploit its potential. The economy, primarily dependent on agriculture and timber, was vulnerable to external shocks, and the country struggled to establish a diversified economy. The French, though no longer in power, still held economic sway over the country, leaving the Central African Republic reliant on foreign aid and trade. Many in the government hoped that a shift towards self-sufficiency and regional cooperation would help alleviate this dependence, but these dreams were slow to materialize. The most immediate issue, however, was the question of whether the Central African Republic could stand on its own in a world where the legacy of colonialism was still fresh and powerful. The newly independent nation was surrounded by neighbors facing similar struggles, and it lacked the political and economic weight to challenge the dominance of France and other former colonial powers. For many, the independence granted in 1960 was merely a symbolic victory, a flag raised in the face of colonialism, but not necessarily the end of the country's reliance on foreign powers. As time went on, the question of national identity loomed larger. In many ways, independence was as much about the creation of a shared sense of belonging as it was about political autonomy. In the early years of independence, the Central African Republic faced a struggle not just to establish a government, but to forge a national identity that could transcend the ethnic divisions that had long shaped its history. This task was complicated by the fact that the country's political leaders were still heavily influenced by their colonial past, with many of them educated in French schools and accustomed to a political system that was foreign to the realities of Central Africa. Despite these difficulties, the Central African Republic's newfound independence sparked a sense of pride among the people. Even though the government was struggling, the people were determined to preserve the hard-won freedom that Boganda and others had fought for. Independence was not just a political change, it was a cultural shift, a reimagining of what the country could become. The central question for the people of the Central African Republic was not whether they had succeeded in becoming independent, but whether they could now create a country that could stand on its own without the shadow of colonialism lingering over them. As the 1960s progressed, the Central African Republic, though independent, found itself navigating a complicated political and economic landscape. The country had gained its freedom from France, but the echoes of colonialism could still be felt in every corner of its society. Despite the initial celebrations, the nation's post-independence reality was filled with more uncertainty than triumph. For David Dacko, the first president of the newly formed republic, the task of guiding the country through this turbulent period seemed increasingly difficult. His presidency, built on the foundations of unity and progress, began to fray under the pressures of internal divisions and external influence. The political challenges Dacko faced were numerous. One of the most significant was the fragmentation of political power. The Central African Republic, like many newly independent nations, was plagued by a weak central government and a fragmented political scene. The various ethnic groups, though united by the desire for independence, continued to operate with deep-seated regional loyalties. These divisions were a lingering legacy of the colonial period, where the French had maintained control by playing different groups against each other. In the face of such divisions, Dacko struggled to create a truly unified government. Despite these internal struggles, the French influence remained strong, albeit in a more subtle form. The system of France-Afrique, a term coined to describe the ongoing political and economic relationships between France and its former colonies, continued to play a significant role in the Central African Republic's development. While the French had granted formal independence, they continued to exert influence over the country's economy, military, and political decisions. Many scholars argue that the Central African Republic's independence was more nominal than substantive, as France maintained a tight grip on its former colonies through economic dependencies and political alliances. Some historians even suggest that the French continued to control their former colonies through a network of client states and puppet leaders, something that the Central African Republic under Dacko's leadership was increasingly forced to accept. Internally, Dacko's government was also grappling with economic instability. The country's economy, dependent on a few primary exports like timber and agricultural products, was weak and vulnerable. The lack of infrastructure and industry made the country reliant on imports, further exacerbating its dependence on foreign powers. As much as Dacko and his government wanted to build a self-sufficient economy, they found themselves constantly battling against the legacy of economic colonialism. The Central African Republic was not an isolated island of freedom. It was a nation caught in the global web of economic dependencies, unable to fully escape the shadow of its colonial past. By 1965, Dacko's presidency, once marked by hopes of unity and progress, began to unravel. A coup led by Jean Bedel Bokassa, a military officer with his own ambitions for power, ousted Dacko and set the stage for a new chapter in the Central African Republic's post-independence history. The coup, although not entirely unexpected given the political instability, marked a dramatic shift in the country's leadership. Bokassa's rise to power was not the peaceful democratic transition that many had hoped for. Instead, it was the beginning of a period of authoritarian rule and political chaos. In the aftermath of the coup, the Central African Republic entered a new phase of its journey, a phase marked by even more political uncertainty, economic struggle, and the continued influence of external powers. The legacy of independence was now tainted by the rise of dictatorship, and the promise of a bright future seemed more distant than ever. Yet despite these setbacks, the Central African Republic remained independent, and its people continued to hold on to the hope that one day they would be able to build the nation they had fought for. The fight for a truly independent and self-sustaining Central African Republic was far from over. The Central African Republic's struggle for stability did not end with the ousting of President Dacko in 1965. In fact, the military coup led by Jean Bedel Bokassa marked a dark turn in the nation's journey. Bokassa, a former soldier in the French army, quickly established himself as the new ruler, declaring himself emperor in 1977 in a move that stunned the nation and the international community. His self-coronation as Emperor Bokassa was an attempt to solidify his control over the country, but it also highlighted the fragile nature of the country's independence. Bokassa's reign was marked by brutality and corruption. His extravagant lifestyle, including lavish state banquets and the construction of an imperial palace, stood in stark contrast to the growing poverty and political instability in the country. The emperor, whose actions were seen as a parody of the colonial aristocracies, also sought to cultivate ties with France, maintaining the strong influence of the former colonial power in the country's political and military affairs. Bokassa's regime became synonymous with oppression, and his rule was characterized by widespread human rights abuses, including political repression and the alleged massacre of schoolchildren protesting the high cost of uniforms. Historians still argue about whether Bokassa's rise to power was simply a result of a power vacuum left by Daco's instability, or whether it was part of a broader pattern of authoritarianism that had gripped many post-colonial African nations. The debate continues about whether Bokassa truly had a vision for the country, or if he was just another dictator seeking to amass personal power. What was clear, however, was that the idealistic dream of a united and democratic Central African Republic had become obscured by the harsh realities of a military regime that lacked the political legitimacy or capacity to govern effectively. Despite the chaos, the people of the Central African Republic never lost sight of the idea of independence, even as it seemed to slip further out of reach. In 1979, after years of economic decline and widespread unrest, Bokassa was overthrown in another coup, this time supported by French forces who had grown disillusioned with his reign. The country once again found itself in a transitional period, moving from one set of rulers to another, each with their own vision for the future. But the legacy of independence, fragile as it was, continued to shape the country's political landscape. For the Central African Republic, independence was never a simple or unbroken triumph. The journey from colonialism to self-rule was fraught with difficulty, and the quest for a stable and sovereign nation was complicated by internal divisions, economic challenges, and the ongoing influence of foreign powers. Even after achieving independence in 1960, the country faced continued struggles, as the central question remained, what does it truly mean to be independent? The political turmoil of the 1970s only deepened this question. The struggle for the Central African Republic was not just about freeing itself from colonial rule, it was about defining what it meant to be free to govern itself and to overcome the legacy of its past. While the road to true independence remained elusive, the story of the Central African Republic is a testament to the resilience of its people. In every corner of the nation, in every village and city, the dream of a stable, self-sufficient republic lived on. The country's journey was far from over. As the years passed and the struggles continued, one thing became clear: the Central African Republic's fight for independence was never simply about political autonomy, but about the deeper struggle for self-determination, dignity, and sovereignty. And as long as the people held on to those ideals, no matter how difficult the road ahead, the true meaning of independence would remain alive in their hearts.